In our final podcast in this set, we're again joined by Atul Gupta from Trilegal in India, and we're covering other key relevant employment law topics in India.
So, Atul, key developments. We understand that the Indian government is expected to introduce a new labour code this year. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and what's expected?
Sure, Tim. So whether the labor codes will be enacted this year is frankly now anyone's guess at the moment. In fact, they were supposed to be enacted in April 2021, but that timeline has been pushed out for various reasons, including the pandemic, protests from various trade unions, etc. Right. So at this point of time, very little clarity exists as to when these are likely to be enforced. The hope and expectation is that they will come into force relatively soon, but no one has a firm sense of when that is going to be. Now, to provide more context, the Indian labor and employment law framework has traditionally been perceived as being fairly, sort of rigid, very, very pro-employee, in many places outdated and confusing, right? Now, so as I was mentioning, even in our first podcast, India has several hundred labor legislations, both at the central level and the state levels, and a lot of delegated legislation to go with it. So any employer doing business in India and who has, let's say, offices and establishments or factories in more than one state, right, has a fairly large task when it comes to complying with Indian employment laws, right? Now, there's been a huge demand to make these more business friendly, to at least remove, unnecessary procedural compliances or provisions that are unnecessarily harsh on businesses, right? So what the government has done is it's taken 29 codes, or rather existing labor laws, and sort of punch them together into 4 new codes. These are the code on wages, the code on social security, the occupational safety, health and working conditions code, or the OSHW code for short, and the industrial relations code. Now, all of them have, as part of our legislative process, been approved by the parliament, received even the presidential assent. But the final step of having them notified and implemented remains to be done. There's a lot of delegated and state level legislation which is still missing. It's yet to be created. So we anticipate that's only going to happen. These codes will only be notified once those legislations are in place.
And could you give us some brief highlights of each of the codes?
Sure, really. I mean, the codes are vast, right? Because they are consolidating several legislations together. But I will spend a few minutes providing just the key highlights on each of the codes. I'll start with the wage code, right, which has consolidated 4 laws relating to minimum wages, the payment of wages, payment of bonuses, and equal remuneration. What is the most drastic change being proposed by the wage code is the concept of a floor wage. So India doesn't have a uniform minimum wage structure. Minimum wage varies from one state and location to another. What is going to happen is there will be a floor wage prescribed by the central government, which might vary based on geographic location. But once a floor wage is prescribed, state governments can't prescribe a lower minimum wage, right, below that. I anticipate this is going to help expand industry and businesses into varying parts of the country and not just concentrated in few locations, right? So I think this is a positive change. Apart from this, the wage code has made provisions regarding equal remuneration, gender neutral. Previously, under the current ER law, only women enjoy that protection. From an ease of doing business perspective, offenses have been decriminalized in many ways. There is no jail term prescribed unless there's repeated similar offenses within 5 years. Offenses can now be compounded, which means, you don't have to go through lengthy court proceedings, and you can sort of enter into a sort of settlement with the authority. Now, but not everything is positive. There are some changes which could be a little bit more difficult for organizations to grapple with. For example, under the current Payment of Wages Act, which determines what deductions can be made from a person's wages, right? The scope of the law is limited in most states. It only applies to people earning below about 24,000 Indian rupees per month, or which is about 240 GBP. Now, the new wage code seems to be removing some of these limits. It's not clear if some of it will be implemented through delegated legislation, but if it is indeed made open to everyone, which would mean it will cover people in even senior positions, then a lot of the benefit structuring that we currently do, right, which involves payments to employees and potential recovery from them, clawback provisions, malus provisions, all of these might get impacted, right? So that is something that organizations would need to plan for. There is a new definition of wages itself in the codes, which could have an incremental cost impact on organizations. For example, some components which are very commonly counted as being part of things like minimum wages, like a house rent allowance, right? For reasons which aren't very clear, seem to be excluded from the definition of wages right now, right? So we'll need to see how these are being interpreted as these codes are implemented, but organizations need to be mindful of these potential impacts. So that was the wage code. I'll deal briefly with the occupational health and working conditions code. Now, this is a pretty massive code which consolidates about 13 legislations dealing with contract labor, interstate migrant workers, factory workers, building and construction workers, mines, dock workers, etc. Right? So it's a pretty massive code. What it is proposing is, rather than having multiple registrations wherever you might have a factory or an establishment, you could have one registration and one consolidated return, which is going to help out with operations. The OSHW code proposes broader health and safety obligations on all employers, who would now be required to ensure that the workplace is free from all types of hazards, right? And there's also obligations cast on employers to conduct regular health checkups for employees, at least those who might, be above the age of 45. Now, apart from that, there are more positive obligations on disposal of hazardous and toxic waste, etc. Now, to diversify the workplace, provisions for the health, safety, and welfare of transgender individuals in the workplace also form a part of the code. Another positive change is that while so far existing laws have tended to be quite restrictive around women working during nighttime hours, the OSHW code recognizes that women can work at night as well as in dangerous operations, subject to some safety conditions. Now, one significant development under the codes, right, which I would want to spend a few minutes on, is the changes to the laws around contract labor. Now, what the new codes and the OSHW code is proposing is that there cannot be any engagement of contract labor in core functions of an operation of any establishment, right? Now, up until now, the existing laws required the government to specifically notify certain operations or industries in which contract labor cannot be engaged. Now, these types of notifications were very few and far in between, because of which organizations often would engage contract workers even in core operations. So the OSH code now changes that regime significantly, right? Now, at the same time, what it is doing is it's creating a new definition of contract labor to start with, right? Now, what this definition states is that if there are people who are regularly employed by the contractor under mutually accepted conditions of employment and who get periodic increments in pay, social security benefits, etc., from that employer, then they will not be treated as contract labor to begin with, right? So this would allow organizations to not treat employees of good service providers, right, who hire employees for their own business needs on an ongoing basis and not just to deploy them to one specific client project, right? So it would allow them to exclude this group of people from the very ambit of contract labor to begin with, right? And therefore, this would also help ease with the compliance burden. So there is a balancing out where, there is, of course, a bar on engagement of contract workers in core functions, who amounts to contract labor itself could end up being a smaller population, right? So there is a balancing out of those burdens under the OSH code. So that was the OSH code. I will briefly talk about the industrial relations code. Now, this is one law which does bring about some very important changes, which the industry has been expecting and hoping for quite some time, right? So the first and most important change being proposed by the industrial relations code, right, is that there are clearer rules around recognition and bargaining with trade unions. Currently, most states in India do not have any specific rules or laws around which union I need to be recognizing, which union should I be bargaining with, right? And very often you will find competing unions in the same establishment raising varying demands. It can get very, very complicated. What the new code, IR code, is proposing is that if there is a single union and subject to certain criteria, it will become the sole negotiating union. If there is more than one union, the union which represents 51% of the employees will become the sole negotiating union. And if no union has that 51% representation from the employees, then a bargaining council, right, will be formed, or a negotiating council will be formed with members from unions which have at least 20% employee representation, right? So this level of clarity, I think, goes a long way in smoothing out industrial relations, right? Now, a couple of other changes which industry will find useful is, it'll become harder for workers to go on unannounced flash strikes or, large scale casual absences, which will all be clubbed together under the common definition of a strike. Employees and workers will have to give a minimum 14-day notice to go on any kind of strike. And once that notice is given, conciliation proceedings with the Labor Department can start, right? And if that officially does begin, then any attempt to go on a strike during the pendency of those conciliation talks would become illegal, right? So this will make operations smoother, and organizations will hopefully be held to ransom in fewer occasions by their workers, right? Especially if they have unreasonable demands. Now, few other changes that the IR code proposes is it revises the threshold basis which certain obligations have to be adhered to. I mentioned in one of the earlier podcasts that India is one of those few countries where factories, mines and plantations need prior government permission to retrench even a single worker. That applies to factories, mines and plantations with 100 or more workers in most part of the country today. The IR code is revising that limit to 300 workers. Although this has been a sore point for the unions who've been pushing back against it. There's also something known as standing orders law, which essentially is a sort of mutually negotiated rules of service, which the Labor Department also blesses. Now, the new code is proposing that this will be required in establishments with 300 or more workers, whereas presently it might be required even in smaller establishments, right? So this is a fairly important code in terms of the proposals it's making. There is also recognition of fixed term employment, which will make hiring of employees in short term roles or gigs or projects a lot easier. It comes with the requirement to pay them gratuity on a prorated basis, even if they have worked for less than 5 years, but it will make engagement and exit of such individuals a lot easier. One important change is that establishments with 20 or more workers will necessarily need to establish a grievance redressal committee. And this is a committee which will need to have equal worker representatives on it. And so it's not just the management creating a committee with its own management representatives. Workers will have a role to play in grievance redressals. and workers could potentially even challenge their own terminations before the grievance redressal committee, right? So while the path to creating this committee is going to be a little bit more challenging for organizations who aren't used to these kinds of structures, in the long run, right, it could help reduce the number of instances where there are disputes that go out and get fought in labor courts. Because if the GRC with even worker representatives find that a terminated employee's grievance is not meritorious, I would say that's a reasonable indication that they might not succeed even if they were to try and appeal that in front of court. So all in all, it can create an environment where with better clarity around negotiating unions, better clarity around when service rules have to be created, grievance redressal committees, etc. The instances where there are disputes which might drag on for years reduces because of the new IR code. Now, this brings me to the last of the four codes. The Social Security Code is again a very significant piece of legislation, and it consolidates laws relating to subjects like Provident Fund, employee state insurance, maternity benefits, gratuity, employee compensation, etc. Right? Interestingly, the SS Code now creates enabling frameworks for gig workers and platform workers. It recognizes that these types of workers are also in need for access to Social Security. So it's proposing that there will be a special fund and a board with a special scheme that would extend to these types of unorganized workers or gig workers, right? There are some other relaxations which organizations will find useful. For example, there can be sharing of creche facilities. Each organization doesn't have to create its own creche. The government is empowered in times of stress like pandemics, epidemics, national disasters, to defer contributions to social security schemes so that employers are not pushed towards significant financial burdens. And these are all learnings from the pandemic right now. I think the most important area that everyone is interested in is the new definition of wages itself, right, which is common across all the codes. It's a fairly complicated definition with certain components treated as included within the definition of wages, some of them which are excluded, some of which are excluded for some purposes, but not the others, right? So as far as making things simpler go, I think the code has failed, but it's going to be a new regime which organizations need to be mindful of. And I anticipate one of the immediate outcomes of these new definitions, once the code is in place, is that there could be incremental cost impact on organizations who may have to pay larger sums towards some benefits like gratuity, Provident Fund for international workers, etc. So I'm advising all organizations to take a very close look at how their compensation is currently structured, examine what components might be treated as inclusions, what might be exclusions, and see if that compensation structure can be recalibrated in a manner which meets with the code's requirements and also minimizes your cost burden, right? Some organizations are presuming that 50% of the salary has to be basic wages. Some of those are misconceptions. So I think these are areas where a significant amount of thinking needs to go into the codes and how you're structuring the wages.
Thanks, Atul. That's really interesting. What are your thoughts on the effect that the codes will have on India?
So I think, given the uncertainty around when they will come, I anticipate there is going to be some amount of time before, these are actually put into place and, there is requisite institutional and logistical supports for them to be properly up and running. But I think these codes can have a significant impact on how India is perceived in the eyes of international businesses on ease of doing business in India. right? We have improved our position in recent times, and I think the labor codes will aid in improving it further. As I said, some of the provisions have been made more business friendly. They are less harsher, decriminalization, compounding, all of these will help organizations focus on compliance for the sake of compliance, and not just because there is some fear of untoward prosecution. Now, of course, I think the codes in itself can't do that in themselves in terms of how India is perceived for doing business. It will have to be married with other economical reforms as well. But having said that, I think the codes are a step forward. Many have criticized it as being just old wine in a new bottle, and yes, I mean it's not completely inaccurate, because a lot of this is just a sort of amalgamation of existing provisions. But I think there are at least some key areas where the codes are doing a lot to try and make things easier for both workers and establishments, and I think that's going to be worthwhile for organizations to see actually being implemented.
So the pandemic's seen a huge increase in remote working in the UK, and this has really accelerated a trend that began even before the pandemic. Is this a trend that you're seeing in India, and are there any other trends that you're seeing emerging as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think as we are seeing internationally, in India too, right, and we've gone through multiple waves of COVID, unfortunately. We are seeing an increasing number of organizations adopt some form of remote working, either sort of a hybrid partial remote working, or even some of them examining complete remote working models. Right now, Indian law and legislation, be it the current laws or even the proposed codes, don't do enough to actually regulate this sufficiently, right? Even though the new codes don't have any significant provision on this. They simply talk about how employers and workers can sort of, agree to work from home, right? Or sort of in mutually accepted conditions. But there are lots of complexities around remote working, which are unfortunately not being addressed by any legislation today. There is a need for a special law on this, which I hope the government will put into place, because I anticipate that 100% back to office is probably not going to happen, even in the long term, and after we're finally out of this pandemic. Now, of course, the reactions to the pandemics have led organizations to sort of get comfortable with this remote working, and this is likely to stay. Organizations will need to plan about how they would comply with state-specific laws if they have remote workers working from locations outside of their physical office locations, right? For example, someone might have an office in Bangalore, but its employees might say, we want to work out of New Delhi or out of Mumbai, where it doesn't have an office or an establishment. How does it then comply with local laws? Does it extend local benefits? Does it pay local professions tax? These are the questions which none of the legislations today are answering. There has been limited court derived jurisprudence. There was a Kerala High Court ruling recently where the court sort of took a very balanced view, and this is a view that I have sort of called out many months in advance as organizations came to us for advice. But it sort of echoed that view and said that, listen, if an employee is working remotely for their own personal preference, right, out of a choice of their own location, a location of their own choice, right, then the organization shouldn't then be burdened with having to deal with sort of benefits or compliances or disputes in that location. It's a different view if, let's say, an organization is placing employees for its own business interest in some other location, maybe sales employees, service staff, right, where deploying people in that remote location is a commercial decision for meeting some of the company's business requirements. Whereas if it's a personal choice of an individual, right, I think it needs to be viewed differently. And that's how I'm sort of also recommending to organizations that you structure your remote working policies and contracts, right? We record whether or not it's in fact a business prerogative or a personal choice that an employee is making.
Great, thank you, Atul. I think that's a lot of issues for a lot of employers around the world dealing with these transitions that we're seeing in the workplace. Very finally, you've obviously given us a lot to think about in terms of key issues in India at the moment. Are there any other issues that you would like to flag to businesses who are employing people in India?
Yeah, Tim, I think one of the other areas where I'm constantly receiving requests for guidance is how do we deal with vaccines, right? And that's become a significant concern for many multinational companies who want to stipulate mandatory vaccinations for their employees, at least for those who are coming into the offices as they reopen. Now, India has a very complicated regime around it. The central government has said that vaccination is voluntary, but because there were significant waves and a lot of deaths and pressures on hospitals, a lot of the state governments have sort of indirectly said that vaccines are mandatory. They're pushing businesses to ensure that their staff are vaccinated. Now, we have seen that these rules and orders keep varying over time. They become more harsh when we are in the middle of a wave. As the wave subsides, some of these orders also go away, which leaves organizations in a very confused state as to what they can do. Right? So far, the trend of the court decisions has been that it's not really likely to find favor with a vaccine or a discipline regime where people might have the ability to dismiss or terminate staff if they refuse to be vaccinated. The one ruling in that we've seen of a Bombay High Court was in the context of a vaccine or test policy, where they said that if a company has facilitated vaccination for its employees and they aren't still willing to be vaccinated for various reasons, it would be fair for an organization to then put them through regular testing at their own cost, right, from a health and safety standpoint. So that's a very quick summary of what we are seeing in the area of vaccinations and whether or not they can be mandatory and what organizations can do in this respect. But it's a very nuanced subject and the position on this is constantly developing. So I would always recommend that organizations always check the latest developments before they choose one way or the other as far as their internal policies go.
Thanks, Atul. That's incredibly helpful. And so that wraps up our series on India. So if you have any queries on the topics we've discussed during these podcasts, please do get in touch with us or Atul. And then please do look out for our next series of podcasts.